Well, hello. First, I really want to take time to thank Brian, Brendan, Kevin, and Doug for hosting and organizing this conference. I think it highlights how complicated and complex this field is. We've gotten to hear from a lot of different perspectives on what's happening in this cannabis research world. I do come at this with two hats. So I professionally represent Tilray, which is a federally licensed medical cannabis producer in Canada, and I'm their director of clinical research. But I also have a personal story that is relevant to how I got into this position, and I'll start with that story. So I received my PhD in neuroscience back in 2005, and then went on to complete my training at UCSF as a postdoc, as most researchers do. And when our second son, Ben, was born, I had to take an extended leave of absence. So Ben started having seizures when he was 14 weeks old, and we were told that he would most likely grow out of it and not to worry too much. So we started with the conventional treatments, and actually none of the therapies that he was put on helped. So he continued to seize relentlessly as we tried medication after medication after medication. When he was a year and a half old, we were told by our epileptologist that we should try a vagus nerve stimulator. This is like a pacemaker that goes in under the skin right here and has a wire that leads up to the vagus nerve and attaches, and then they send electrical signals up to the brain to try to stop seizures. That surgery didn't work. So we continued to try more and more combinations of therapies. He ended up on higher doses and more drugs than we had wanted him to be on ever in his life. He wasn't developing well. Around 2012, I was living near Stanford, and I had found at Stanford these three basic scientists who were working in the epilepsy field, and they were offering a competitive fellowship to join them. So I applied for the fellowship and miraculously got accepted and started in May of 2012 at Stanford. And my goal really was just to contribute to our overall base knowledge of this disease, to figure out how we could develop new therapies for this third of patients with epilepsy that continue to have seizures despite all of the 40 or so available FDA-approved anti-seizure drugs on the market. And Dr. Gaetanis mentioned this earlier. At Stanford, soon after I started, actually, I went to a conference, and this conference was unusual because it included a family day that encouraged families without scientific training to come and learn about the new therapies being developed. It was a conference that was hosted by the Epilepsy Therapy Project, which was developed by another father of a child with severe epilepsy named Warren Lammert, a really wonderful organization that has since merged with the Epilepsy Therapy Project. At this family day, I met a dad who told me that he was treating his son with cannabis. And I said, what do you mean you're treating your son with cannabis? How old is your son? And he said, my son's 5. And I was incredulous. I mean, I don't know much about cannabis and children, but I know that you can't really expect a delayed child to inhale cannabis. And I had no idea how people were giving their children cannabis other than that. I also knew that there's a lot in cannabis, and I couldn't figure out how he was determining what to give the child. But he insisted it was helping him a lot, and he said he would take cannabis rich in cannabidiol and make butters and give his son, a teaspoon or so a day. So I took this information and went back to my computer and looked up cannabidiol and epilepsy. And the first studies that popped up were, of course, Dr. Mechoulam's studies, the clinical trials that he did in collaboration with the Brazilians in 1978 and 80. And they were encouraging. So like he showed earlier, at least half of the patients were really responding well to cannabidiol. And remember, these are patients that were treatment resistant, so a difficult to treat population that was responding to this dose of cannabidiol that was around 200 to 300 milligrams per day. That was encouraging. And then I also found these animal studies. And in the animal studies, CBD either had no effect or it was anticonvulsive, whereas THC could be pro or anticonvulsive. So I got a little nervous about THC and decided to proceed with CBD. And I found a dispensary, I found a medical marijuana card, I bought anything that was rich in CBD, and then I said, oh, shoot, what do I do with this? I don't really know. I'm not a chemist. I can't give my son this plant material. He was 3 years old, very developmentally delayed. So I went to UC Davis and found a professor of chemistry who also happened to have a medical marijuana testing lab, told him our story, and he agreed to help me figure out how to extract the cannabinoids, all the cannabinoids, and then remove the THC. So extraction was not hard. It was the column purification that led to the removal of the THC that was most difficult. But we did it, and we were able to get, a little tube full of cannabidiol that was very concentrated. So now I had this little tube, and I didn't know where to start as far as dosing. And I did this all telling my doctor that I was doing it. He was fully supportive, and he said, great, go for it. Yes, we've heard parents are treating their kids with cannabinoids, but I have no idea what to tell you, what to get, where to get it, or how much to give him. So I emailed Dr. Mitchullam, and I said, I found your papers. I have this son with severe epilepsy. I have some CBD. What do I do? What are your thoughts? He was very kind and emailed me back right away and said, oh, I don't know. Start with the lowest doses we used in our clinical trials. It was very safe. And so I did that, and interestingly, the lowest dose they used was 200 milligrams of CBD. At the time, Ben weighed 10 kilograms. So if you remember Dr. Davinsky's talk about the Epidiolex trial, it's 20 milligrams per kilogram. That happened to be right in the appropriate dose of cannabidiol, which I think is interesting. So I gave it to Ben, and he responded. And he was doing better when he had, after a few days of having this cannabidiol. So now making this medication in my garage with my homemade chemistry set became absolutely nerve-wracking. And it was nerve-wracking because there was no way to set up a consistent way to do it. So I never could get a consistent supply of the same kind of cannabis to start with, and I never could get even a consistent supply of the C18 beads that filled each column. So I wasn't able to, reproduce it every time. And I thought there must be a better way. So I contacted GW Pharma, hoping that they would be willing to make a pharmaceutical version of pure CBD for me. And they didn't get back to me. And everyone told me that I was crazy to have thought they might consider giving this medically fragile child a cannabinoid. At that time, it seems like it's a no-brainer now that they would do it, but back then it was really a risky thing to do. It was risky politically, and it was still a cannabinoid, even though it wasn't THC. And so I just assumed they weren't interested in treating this difficult-to-treat medically fragile population. So I continued to make cannabidiol, and then I shared it with another family who I'd met. I had met his son. The son had a very severe form of epilepsy and had hundreds of seizures a day. And this family also had a hard time finding CBD. So I shared the CBD with them. And unlike my son's kind of more tempered response, this family's response was incredible. So this child went from having hundreds of seizures a day to a couple seizures a day. And that family, being very, very motivated, of course, was able to get through to GW Pharma's founder, Jeffrey Guy. And Jeffrey Guy is an interesting man. He's very charismatic, and he wants to help. And but he wanted to know if it was pure CBD we were giving our children or some combination of CBD and THC, because that would be trickier to address. So we had our samples tested at NIDA, and lo and behold, it came back without any THC in it. So that launched a series of events that is really well recounted in Fred Fogelstein's article that was published last year in Wired magazine, really worth reading, which I won't go into now, but it was really the collective effort of these families, in particular Dr. Davinsky and Jeffrey Guy, to go through all the hoops to make this happen for us to get compassionate use INDs opened in the US with FDA approval, NDA approval, so that we could get cannabidiol through our doctors. And I wish I could tell you that this was the end of our story. It's the end of that boy's story because his response was amazing. It's not the end of our story because my son's response was, like I said, more tempered. I reported a seizure frequency reduction of about 40% to our doctor, and she decided that that wasn't enough of a response to warrant the continued use of this investigational drug. So against my wishes and begging her not to, she still removed him from the IND. And so 2 years later, we were right where we started, which was knowing that we had something that might potentially help him, but not having access to it. So that was in 2014. And over the next 2 years, I probably spent one and a half of those years trying all sorts of artisanal preparations, all without the guidance of our doctor. And I don't feel qualified to treat brain disease. I'm not an epileptologist. I think it puts a huge burden on the family when the family has to manage medications and decide what dose to give and make sure that it doesn't have any bad side effects or interactions with other drugs. So I was very uncomfortable doing this. And I also, all the preparations that I got, I could never fully quantify. Like different testing labs would give me different results, and I was never 100% sure of the dose that was in these products. But I would give them to Ben in the hopes that it at least wouldn't hurt him. And then one time I gave him something that made his seizures much, much worse. And that was the worst feeling as a parent, to know that you gave your child something in an experimental way, hoping it would help him, and then watch him deteriorate over the next 2 days. So after that happened, I decided I couldn't keep trying with these artisanal preparations of CBD and CBD. They were always some combination of CBD and THC. So my guess is that my child is one of the children that does not respond well to THC. Now, thanks to another IND with another doctor, we do have access to Epidiolex again. And I really want to publicly thank GW Pharma for everything they've done for me and for all the children who have treatment-resistant epilepsy, because starting this program was not easy. There were a lot of hurdles to overcome. It was costly, and it was risky on their part to do it back in 2013. And it's thanks to them today that I have access. The current doctor that Ben's seeing actually was willing to rearrange his other drug regimen, and he's on a regimen that includes 3 drugs. Epidiolex is one of them, and he's had no generalized tonic-clonic seizure in over 4 months. No, I can't, but it's, for us, it's just not that simple, because he's still having these little seconds-long seizures during the day. I honestly can't say whether it's the Epidiolex that in the end was the magic potion that was part of this concoction that helped control his seizures. It's hard to know. Maybe it was just natural development of the disease. And that's the problem with these N-of-1 trials, right? You never really know why you're seeing the result you're seeing. And the goal now, I think, with all of these stories is to try to figure out how to generalize these individual responses to a larger population and understand how drugs affect certain specific diseases. In epilepsy, for one, they chose Dravet syndrome to focus on because epilepsy is not one disease. There are hundreds of different etiologically distinct mechanisms that lead to seizures. So when you want to do good, clean clinical research in epilepsy, it's really smart to stratify them by their distinct etiology, right? It doesn't make sense to throw everybody into the same category. So I would say that the current system fails patients, and this is just illustrated in my story, because in the state-based, in California, where we have state-based medical cannabis regulations, the major issues I ran into were the lack of a safe and reliable product. So if you're going to treat something as severe as epilepsy, you have to find that product, but then you have to be able to go back and find it over and over and over again. There can't be this question of whether or not it will be available to you next month or next year. It has to be there all the time. And without these safe and reliable products, I felt like I didn't get adequate medical supervision for Ben. And I was on my own treating this very severe brain disease and completely unqualified to do that. And on the FDA side, I think you have accessibility issues, as I illustrated. I think there's the fear maybe that a physician will be a gatekeeper. I think that's probably going to be rare, but it happened. And when it did happen, I had no recourse. I couldn't apply to the FDA. I went everywhere. I went to the director of Epilepsy Center at UCSF. I went to the FDA. I went to GW Pharma. I went to everyone I could think of to, ask to remain on Epidiolex, but I couldn't. There was nothing we could do. And I don't want another patient to have to be in that position. So I think accessibility is a concern when you go through the FDA process. And then there, of course, we'd be remiss not to mention insurance coverage and cost issues, which I don't think are necessarily going to be a problem, but it's an issue that I want to bring up because it's something we have to think about. I think no one can argue that GW Pharma is not doing the right thing in conducting these trials. They have to conduct these trials. And if they had decided not to move ahead with these trials, there would have been a lot of backlash in them not doing the work they needed to do for this patient population. So I think it's excellent that they're moving ahead and that they're getting real clinical data. And as you heard Oren said, there's actually no way we could treat patients without that data in an informed way. So just to illustrate, I think right now we have a sliver of the patients who could benefit. Let's just take the epilepsy patients. There are 3 million patients with epilepsy in the US. You have a tiny sliver of these patients accessing cannabinoids for therapy that could really potentially benefit them. And my goal is to make that a much larger piece of the pie. And I think we can do that collectively by mainstreaming this medicine. But there are a few requirements to mainstream the medicine, and it requires a lot of really hard work. The first thing we need is clinical data. Physicians prescribe medications based on the data you give them, and normally they get data from clinical trials, like the data that Oren presented, and they take that data and they start prescribing, and they get experience prescribing, and over time, it's the data from clinical trials plus the experience they have prescribing the drug in individual cases. I would say every patient is an N of 1 and should be treated like an N of 1, right? And you should maximize treatment for that N of 1 patient. And over time, doctors assimilate both sets of information to provide the best treatment they can. And they can't do that without the basic clinical data that is currently completely lacking in this field. That would be data on safe dose and titration schedules, basic safety profiles in specific patient populations. Like Kevin was mentioning earlier, patients on valproate and CBD have a higher risk of liver failure, right? Side effects profiles need to be known, adverse events, drug-drug interactions, and then expected outcomes or efficacy data would be also really good down the road. And I think the major hurdle to being able to collect this clinical data has been a lack of appropriate medical preparations. And this is one of the reasons why I think we have to really think carefully about the preparations that we're giving patients when we talk about collecting clinical data. So data collection is actually a rigorous discipline. It requires a lot of work and thought, and unless you have the right compound, the right chemical, and the dose, the chemical composition, and a really safe product, you can't get the kind of clinical data you need that you can interpret then and use. The products have to be chemically defined, obviously, and they have to be reliable and reproducible. So I think it's encouraging that the current spectrum of regulations are changing at a rapid rate, but I would argue that most of the regulations popping up in new countries like Germany and Australia and Croatia, they're all governing access, even all the US states, right? They govern access to medical marijuana, but they're not governing production practices of medical marijuana. And you have to have both, and you have to have a set of thoughtful regulations at the federal level that govern production practices so that you can get the preparations you need for medical use. Now remember, I'm talking about a spectrum of cannabis use from adult to, wellness, therapeutic, and medical. And everything I say completely fits into this medical piece of medical cannabis use. You can't define a medicine unless you have a defined chemical composition. So I work for Tilray, like I said earlier, and the reason I work for Tilray is because I think Tilray arguably is the only country in the world that has a federal oversight of the production of medical cannabis that can be shipped directly to patients. And just a few months ago, we also got Health Canada approval to make extracts. And I feel like a broken record, but without these extracts with a defined chemical composition that are completely safe, we can't start our clinical trials. So now that we have those, we can start providing study drugs to researchers globally. And we are. So I wish I had data already. Maybe next year we'll have some data, but we're partnering with the University of Sydney in Australia for a chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting study, and we'll be providing them with a liquid capsule form of a defined chemical content. We really hope to see good efficacy there. And in Canada, we're partnering with the Ontario Brain Institute to look at the effects of cannabinoids in adults with refractory epilepsy. And these are two types of trials that actually give you the data you need for regulatory approval. They're very stringent, they're rigorous, they're difficult to do, they have placebo controls. And I think Oren did a nice job of explaining the difference between RCTs, or randomized placebo-controlled trials, and open-label trials. So from open-label trials and databases, if they're done well, you can get really good information on how to treat your patients. And we all know that we're not going to wait for RCTs to finish while patients need help. So I would argue that the path forward has to involve both happening at the same time as quickly as possible. And I would put in a plea to everyone to fully collaborate on getting these trials done, because I spoke with Nick Linceris yesterday about clinical research. He's a clinical trialist from Australia, very forward-thinking in this field. And the N of 40 trials, the N of 20, the N of 40, the N of 30, many of those trials are not the same as a few good N of 3,000 trials. And so I think that's how we collaborate to get the real data that will inform treatment. And so I want to leave you with a quote by a good friend of mine, Tom Baruch, who said, "When science gets politicized, rational discourse disappears." And I feel like that really has happened in this field. We're not addressing this in a rational, thoughtful way, but we can, and we should. And I would urge everyone in this room to start thinking rationally and accept that there are different ways to get to the same goal, and that everyone in the room probably has the same goal, but different approaches towards that goal. And I just wanted to point out that Ben is my son, and I've presented him as my son, but he's also a brother and a grandson and a nephew. And I feel like the debate over whether or not to provide him with something that would save his life, the debate should no longer be about whether to provide him access, right? The debate should now be about how to provide him access. What are the thoughtful policies that we can enact so that no other family has to go through what we've gone through? And it's not over. I mean, we were the lucky ones. We were the really lucky ones. There are 200,000 kids out there who still don't have access to pure cannabidiol. Thank you.